Jason, I think we have been overdue. You think we have been overdue to have a conversation about trust models.
We do a lot of PKI topicality on this podcast. And funny enough, trust models is something we've only touched on.
Yeah.
That shows you how deep of the subject PKI is in general. You know, one of the beauty topics of PKI in general is how you bestow trust. Mm-hmm. And the old story of, a lot of people like to start with Alice and Bob.
Yeah.
I like to start with it a little more real world, which is, if you and I wanted to do business together, we have several choices to make in terms of how we can transfer a secret between each other or identify who each other is. And we can do that through shared secrets.
Right.
A shared secret being, you knock on my door later and I know it's you. If we agree that you knock 4.5 times,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. With PKI, what's great about it is, especially in terms of centralized PKI that works out of a certificate authority.
Yeah.
Not only do we have this great key pair that gets generated, and you and I can have public keys that we can share between each other so that we can almost get trust delegated to us by a centralized system
Right.
that bestowed trust to us by issuing this key pair.
Yeah.
But how do you trust roots themselves? So this is where the storyline is a little different, because most of the trust bestowing that we've talked about on this podcast is about the end entities. You and I, at the end of the day, doing some sort of business together, or a web browser and a web server, communicating to each other with certificates. I would say that what's interesting is that if you take a look at the public trust model, in other words, publicly trusted certificates are generated from, obviously, a publicly trusted root.
Right.
And those publicly trusted roots are essentially, issuing CAs that are signing certificate signing requests, but they themselves, those roots, have another root behind them. There's an offline route to the issuing route.
Right.
And that's part of how you make publicly trusted infrastructure so secure.
Yeah.
Because if the offline route is offline, and what I mean offline, I don't necessarily mean the computer is off.
Right.
I do mean, though, that it's not on a network.
It is air-gapped.
It is air-gapped.
Yes, we have air-gapped roots. They're on devices that are not connected to the internet.
Right.
Right.
And the creation of a new public issuing route is a big deal.
Yeah.
A very big deal.
Yeah.
I think it was Bruno Couillard at the ICMC conference this week who talked about these key signing ceremonies as people come from out of the woodwork with black robes on and come into a room. He kind of made a dramatic mental image, but
It's actually much less exciting.
it's way less exciting than that.
But there are some rules and things.
There are
right?
mega rules.
For instance, one of the big rules is nobody can ever be alone. Right? You have multiple trusted individuals with trusted individual status, and you are not allowed to be alone with the HSM.
Right.
Right?
So when we talk about roots of trust, we're talking about systems that are in a very limited numbers of hands.
Yep.
Sometimes in a cage, physical cage that limits the people that can go in there.
Ours are physically caged.
And multiple witnesses to USB keys being stuck in, and my goodness.
Yep. PKI-based access, cameras, video, all of this stuff is part of the,
And so why so much work, Tim? It's because you're bestowing trust on the thing that's going to be bestowing trust.
Right. That ultimately will bestow trust on millions of servers around the globe, and billions of individuals will rely on those as relying parties.
So that's an example of a trust model hierarchy where there is a root and then an issuing route, right? An offline route and an issuing route is typically the way we would say it. But do you have to do it that way? No, you could have just an issuing route, but then you risk If the private key of that was compromised somehow,
Yeah.
well, then anybody can issue what they want.
Yeah.
Or
At which point you need to completely distrust that root, and that is incredibly damaging.
exactly. And why do you keep your highest level root that bestows trust to issuing roots offline? It's because if that weren't protected as much as it would, a bad guy could create their own issuing roots.
Yeah. Hypothetically, let's suppose, like one of the false assumptions in security that you can't have and that we can't have is that you're impenetrable. Because everybody who has ever been penetrated, been owned, that happened in a way they weren't expecting, right? Fundamentally, that's the problem with the unknown. And so if your offline roots are air gapped, then it doesn't matter. You could be the very best hacker in the world, and you can't get there because there isn't a wire. And that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, you're now at the point of talking about lock-picking cages, and,
Yeah.
which are on camera, et
Which
cetera, et
are
cetera.
inside of controlled facilities,
Yes.
and they're bomb-proof, and they have guards, and yes, exactly.
Yes, and so therefore, when we talk about Sectigo, it's not advertisement. This is just how hard it is to be a public CA.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why Sectigo exists is, and we're proud of our heritage of being a public CA, is because we know how to set up an incredibly secure root hierarchy.
Right.
Like that's if we have an expertise, that's our expertise.
Yeah.
And then scaling, obviously. But setting up a incredibly secure trust model is what we do. And therefore, for those of you who are thinking about private certificate authorities, this is going to get into another podcast, Tim, but OpenSSL released version 3.5 of their open platform to create, you can create a private CA in minutes with OpenSSL 3.5. Should you? Well, for experimental purposes, sure.
Yeah.
Are
Absolutely.
you
For
are
a dev
you
environment, why
are
not?
you putting in the rigor that a public trust root program would? Not even close by a million miles.
And for, depending on the customer, for a lot of enterprises, they will probably never have to put in the same level of rigor as we would as a public CA because the stakes are lower. But you should think about the level of rigor you do want to put in, because if you just have, if you just have it sitting on just some system somewhere, that if the bad guys get in, they can ultimately own that and issue their own private CA roots inside of your environment, then you can be completely owned.
Tim, so let me ask you a question on what you just said.
Yeah.
If you're standing up a Microsoft Certificate Authority, Microsoft Active Directory Certificate Services, or you are standing up an on-prem Quickie OpenSSL 3.5 private CA
Yeah.
underneath somebody's desk, perhaps being a cert pump to a Kubernetes cluster
Right.
in an experimental way. And in neither one of those scenarios, you actually generate the private key of the root inside of an HSM.
Right.
What do you have?
You have a vulnerable private key. You have a private key that in principle could get owned, right? Like the whole point behind putting these private keys into an HSM or a TPM is to protect against that kind of scenario.
I just spent 4 days with the brightest minds in the HSM world. And there was more than 4 days of material to be spoken about, but we cut it off after 4 days. And it amazes me that people stand up their own private certificate authorities without any regard to how to do it properly. Not just securely,
Yeah.
just properly. And it blows my mind. So therefore, this is why we're talking about trust models. Because a lot of people don't realize that if you go with a properly hosted private CA for yourselves, and you don't just bake it yourself,
Right.
you're getting that heritage.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing like technically, there's nothing from a computer science perspective to prevent you from creating a proper private CA inside your own environment. And I think there absolutely are enterprises who are able to do that. I think in general there are enterprises where the level of resourcing is very high. And usually it's because the stakes are very high. Think about a global financial institution or a global 1,000 enterprise where they can afford to hire people who have a career of focus on PKI and know perfectly well how to do this. And they can afford things like HSMs, which are not cheap, which you can go buy, and they have their own racks in adequately secure facilities, either that they own or rent, and all the rest, right? But you get out of that category where you can afford that level of investment pretty quickly. And then most of the businesses in the world just can't afford to do that at that level. And at that point, that's where you imagine somebody who focuses on that. They have that expertise. They have those investments in things like equipment and facilities, who can make those investments once and make them available to a variety of businesses. And that's where the managed PKI model comes in.
Pop quiz.
Okay.
How many people with that level of skill set who can fire up truly secure private CAs, how many of that percentage of the world, that world's population, do you think you have the phone number of, you've been to beer with,
Right.
you've had a coffee with? Honest question, what do you think?
Me personally, I know a fair number of those people.
I would say for myself, it's crazy. I'm betting I know a very significant number of the entire world's population of people who are actually capable of that.
Right.
And that's crazy to say. Point I'm trying to make is that those people are very rare.
Yeah. It's a real specific skill set. And I think this is one of these things where it's not that hard to get good enough to make something that works and runs. What you want to do is you want to be very open-eyed about saying, is works and runs really the bar here? And for certain use cases, I think, frankly, it is. But definitely for some, it's not. And am I thinking clearly about those criteria?
I'm going to draw a line. Sue me. Don't sue me. If you disagree. Too late. I would say, Tim, if you're setting up a private CA for the purposes of, say, hey, we talked about earlier at a previous podcast about client authentication TLS certificates that you might have to pull from a public CA and now start to run your own private CA. And you're wondering, geez, to what level do I have to build a private CA for that? Right. Client authentication private CA certificates, I would say you don't need to go off and buy that $50,000 singular HSM box. What I am saying, though, is that going with a provider that will offer you a multi-tenant HSM option to create your root, which can sign an issuing CA that is now very secure and putting out all the certs you need into the hands of the client authentication holders, that is the modern way of doing things. And that gets away from having to hire those big skill sets. Yeah. That's the modern way of doing it. Yeah. And it's the proper way of doing it. And I think that people who are looking at replacing or augmenting the Microsoft CA or doing the safe alternative to OpenSSL, just as an open source example, there are ways to do that. I just don't think enough people know about it. So Tim, before we end this podcast and go to the second half, which is about trust models, PKI trust models in the context of PQC. That's the next one I want to do.
Yeah, good. I wanted to bring that up, so let's do that.
Let's talk about a couple of examples of well-known PKI trust models that you might not think of as a trust model, but absolutely are great examples.
Okay.
The U.S. Federal Bridge.
Okay.
Is a trust model.
Sure.
So in other words, the U.S. Federal Bridge is all about cross-signing. That's a term that we don't use a lot because it's not done a ton anymore. But that's where the U.S. federal government can, through a rigorous process, will cross-sign other people's CAs and essentially sign issuing CAs that then root up. The trust chain is all the way up to the U.S. federal government, and you can issue certificates as a subordinate of the U.S. federal bridge.
Sure.
So that is a trust model. It is a PKI trust model hierarchy. I'll give you another really good example is, and I've been personally involved with a lot of IoT PKI consortia. In other words, there are a lot of IoT communication models that have PKI built right in. And the model is interesting, and sometimes they will dual source from two different private CA systems where there is a hierarchy of an offline route, sometimes several issuing routes, and sometimes there is even cross-signing with one or two of the major members within the consortia in order, and all of this is to be able to bestow trust amongst third parties.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say private CA, and on the one hand, I agree with that characterization, and the other hand, I kind of don't, right? They're almost like quasi-public CAs. They're sort of, it's a shared trust that is bigger than the individual manufacturers or enterprises that are using those certs, that are relying on those certs.
It's a walled garden.
It's a walled garden, but it's a multi-tenant walled garden, right? As opposed to, it's not all the way as public as what we call a public CA, but it's more publicer than what we normally call a private CA. It's kind of this interesting multi-tenant, kind of public-ish use case.
Not governed by CAB Forum.
Right.
Therefore, not public.
Governed by its own thing.
Governed by its own thing.
Right, which is its own consortium, which presumably has its own rules and its own enforcement of those rules and its own CAs.
Yes.
And therefore its own routes, which aren't sitting in the hardware that's shipped right out of the manufacturer. You don't get your server from your server manufacturer and plug it in, and those routes are there already. You have to put them in. And so those get put in, and that's where you're opting in as a participant in that multi-tenant walled garden, quasi-public use case.
And quite often, consortia of large tech companies will get those private CAs, I'll call it private for now, from a public CA.
Right.
Because public CAs
Yes.
have the heritage of setting up.
Public CAs have the chops to do this. They know how to, and they are usually, almost always, the providers. Public CAs or TSPs, which are kind of public CAs within another word, trusted service providers. It's an Etsy thing. Sometimes it'll be a TSP who participates. And they're doing that because, again, they have to have the same capabilities.
It really all comes down to bestowing trust within a hierarchical boundary.
Yeah.
And if you fire up your own private CA, you can bestow trust to another route, and that route can bestow trust to another route. There's no limit to the hierarchy.
Sure.
That's one point. And then the other point is, at some point, there's going to be an issuing CA that is issuing the end certificates, the end use certificates, end user certificates, for the purposes of authentication or signing or encryption or whatever the point is, typically authentication. And a lot of people don't realize that there is a lot of flexibility within PKI trust models by people like the public trust companies who happen to also sometimes offer private trust systems, private CAs. The amount of flexibility that's available is actually quite remarkable, and most people don't ask for it or take advantage of it. And so I'm going to leave you with just one more example, which is there are some people out there who absolutely obsess over, I don't want my private key of my highest order route to be in the hands of my issuing CA provider.
Okay.
And whenever I hear that, my answer is, yeah, no problem. And a lot of people are surprised by that. And that is going to lead to the next podcast, which is you can absolutely hold close to your chest perhaps a small HSM, a legacy HSM, a legacy private CA, which can then sign a very, very modern private CA. And that modern private CA can become merely the issuing certificate authority. So you, in possession of your, ultimately that sacred private key that holds the trust to everything, you can sign multiple issuing CAs and get a lot of work done with a hosted provider. And a lot of people don't realize they can have that, and that's provided to them by PKI trust models.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So keep that in mind, because you and I, Tim, are now going to talk about now that we know this, let's talk about how that's important in the PQC era.
Okay, great. I love it.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jason. This has been Rukazis.